Welcome to
America's Cannabis Conversation,
where you can hear experts from all facets of the cannabis business as to what's happening in this exploding industry. Keep yourself informed. Join the conversation. This is Dan Perkins for your American Cannabis Conversation. Quick news. Washington, D.C. Mitch McConnell and other GOP lawmakers slam marijuana banking provisions in new coronavirus bill. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, Republican of Kentucky, complained in a floor speech on Thursday that House Democrats were pushing for diversity detectives to study equity in the marijuana industry as part of their latest coronavirus relief package. Like several other GOP legislators in recent days, the Majority Leader said Democrats were making partisan demands in the new legislation filed this week. He zeroed in on a specific part of a section that would protect banks that service cannabis businesses from being penalized by federal regulators. McConnell called language requiring research on minority-owned and women-owned marijuana business the cherry on the top, and sarcastically referred to this as a bold new policy from Washington Democrats that would kick the coronavirus to the curb and save American families from this crisis. Here it is, a new annual study on diversity and inclusion within the cannabis industry. Not one study, but two of them, he said. Let me say that again. Democrats proposed a coronavirus bill which includes taxpayer-funded studies to measure diversity and inclusion among the people who profit out of marijuana. Baltimore, Maryland. Cannabis may ease opioid withdrawal symptoms, Johns Hopkins study finds. Researchers are calling for formal clinical trials into the efficacy of marijuana for treating opioid use disorder after a newly publicized study found that cannabis may ease many common symptoms of opioid withdrawal. The study, conducted by researchers at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine and published in the forthcoming issue of the Journal of Substance Abuse Treatment, asked 200 people with the past month opioid and marijuana use whether their symptoms of opioid withdrawal improved or worsened when they consumed cannabis. Of the 125 respondents who used marijuana to treat their withdrawal, nearly three-quarters, 72%, said it eased their symptoms, while only 6.4% said it made them worse. Another 20% reported mixed results, and 3 people, 2.4%, said the cannabis didn't seem to have any obvious effect either way. The results show that cannabis may improve opioid withdrawal symptoms, and the size of the effect is clinically meaningful. And our last story is a very important story. It comes from Haifa, Israel. Israeli researchers plan to study cannabis as a treatment for COVID-19. A Haifa-based research center is planning to study cannabis as a potential treatment for COVID-19. Medical researchers in Israel are planning to study the potential for cannabis to be used as a treatment for COVID-19, the disease caused by the novel coronavirus. The investigators at the Center for Research at Rambin Healthcare campus in Haifa have been studying the effects of cannabis on severely ill COVID-19 patients and plan to begin clinical trials in the next few months. Dr. Laura Hagen, director of research at the center, said he is leading a team of investigators in the anti-inflammatory properties of cannabis if it can help to prevent severe inflammatory reaction known as cytokine storm. Information gathered on the disease to date shows that many of the patients who have died from COVID-19 have suffered from uncontrolled inflammatory response. Cannabis has known anti-inflammatory properties, and we have been conducting advanced research on the use of cannabis to treat other diseases with widespread inflammatory responses. At the outbreak of COVID-19 epidemic, we directed our efforts and experience to join with the world's battle against the epidemic. Scientists at the Center for Cannabis Research have identified 15 strains of cannabis that appear to have the ability to prevent cytokine storm. Dr. Hayen believes that cannabinoids and the body's endocannabinoid system may help modulate the immune system's response to invaders such as the coronavirus. We hope that by decoding the cannabinoid activity mechanisms during the inflammatory storms, we can treat COVID-19 patients where conventional drugs have failed. The uniqueness of our cannabis treatment is based on our understanding of the mechanisms of cannabinoids, their activity, and and the scientific findings. I hope this can work. This is your quick news, and remember that you can hear new quick news twice a week on Wednesdays and Saturdays, and you can hear special sections of the American Cannabis Conversations Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday. So let's see who's joining the conversation today. Joining us on the show today is Morgan Fox from the National Cannabis Industry Association, and he's going to talk about legislation that recognizes the important nature of cannabis dispensaries and possible changes in the banking law. Next, we have Dr. Michael Lewis, who's going to help us understand how to deal with the various kinds of depression that we may be experiencing during this crisis. Next, we will have Rich Wolkoff, our roving reporter, who'll do an interview with Tara Carver, a co-founder of an important part of the cannabis industry. And last, we will have our cannabis doctor on call, Jordan Tishler, who's going to give us some advice on what to do during this pandemic crisis. Remember, if you missed any segment on this show or any other show, you can go to W420radionetwork.com, go to the archive section, and download any show you want. And now, let's start the conversation. Welcome back to the conversation, and joining us today is Morgan Fox from the National Cannabis Industry Association. We're going to talk to him about the position that the NCIA has on changes to the banking rules because of the importance of dispensaries staying open. So welcome to the conversation, Morgan.
Thanks for having me again.
So talk to us about your association's position.
Obviously, the NCIA has always been in favor of the Safe Banking Act, and we were instrumental in pushing it through the House in September. And from basically the beginning of the coronavirus response, we realized that it was necessary now more than ever. I mean, all of the existing public safety and health concerns that are created by lack of access to banking still existed, but they were exacerbated by the coronavirus response and the need to try to limit in-person close proximity transactions and the fact that cash can carry coronavirus on it for up to 17 days. So, in addition to the financial aspects, there was a real urgency for public health to get this included. So we've been pushing Congress to include some version of the cannabis banking reform in the next coronavirus response. And House leadership did include the Safe Banking Act word for word in the latest version, which is called the HEROES Act. So we're very, very happy about that. It hasn't passed the House yet, so it's not actually rule. And then it has to go to the Senate, where we anticipate a much greater battle, not necessarily for this particular provision, but for the passing any form of relief legislation at all. And in fact, I think that given everything that's going on, the Senate is probably not very likely to focus on trying to strip this provision out of a relief package if they're willing to consider one. So we've got our fingers crossed, and we're putting pressure on senators already to seriously consider the health impacts of continuing to deny banking services to cannabis businesses.
Cannabis was used 65 times in this new bill. Your observation about the likelihood of it getting through the Senate is important. This particular bill, the 1,800 pages, there are a number of people, even some Democrats, who think it's absolutely absurd to add another $3 trillion. And they look at all of the funding for the National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities and on and on and on. They're having a difficult time trying to figure out how that was related to coronavirus. So do you think it's just going to go to the Senate and you're going to die? What do you think is going to happen?
I think that really depends on what the political situation is when the House approves it. So it's really just a wait and see. But like I said, we're making inroads in the Senate right now to try to get them to consider this. And, we're continuing pressure to get the standalone Safe Banking Act a markup in the Senate Banking Committee, although those efforts have slowed down a little bit because most of the Senate is focused on coronavirus-related issues. Right. But that being said, I think that it's important to note that provision would not actually cost the government or the taxpayers anything. It's simply allowing banks to be able to work with cannabis businesses.
If that were to happen and more of the money that's been sitting in suitcases and lockers and wall safes and everything else, the legacy cash coming into the marketplace could make it a source of capital for rebuilding and expanding the the industry. I've seen a number of reports that talk about how business was up dramatically and continued to be up dramatically in the medical marijuana dispensaries, more so than in the recreational dispensaries. But the medical marijuana has just seen phenomenal numbers that were exceeding what a lot of people thought was going on. So there are obviously a lot of people concerned enough about what's going on in their lives that they're wanting to turn to cannabis. So do you think that this surge it will play itself out, or is this a fundamental shift in what's happening in the cannabis business?
Well, first of all, I think that the reports of how well the cannabis industry is doing regarding sales are actually a little bit overblown. If you look at the studies that have come out that are based on transaction reporting to the states, they don't really jive with what is being reported in most of the actual sales revenue by these companies. So I think that it's a little bit inaccurate to say that the cannabis industry is booming right now, and it also is very different from state to state as well as business to business. But I think that it's also important to note that just because cannabis businesses have large stockpiles of cash because they don't have access to banking doesn't mean that they haven't been paying their taxes. I think that it's important for states to recognize that they need to support cannabis businesses and help them survive the pandemic so that they can continue to generate tax revenue for those states in the recovery period. But the Safe Banking Act is not necessarily about increasing tax revenue. It's mostly about increasing public safety, public health, and decreasing the financial strains on individual cannabis businesses that are going to make it harder for them to survive and continue to generate tax revenue for states and the federal government.
Before this virus struck, the cannabis industry had a tough 2018, 2019, and even going into 2020, started off the year in serious decline in terms of sales, businesses looking at shortage of cash, and investors losing interest in the industry in general. Do you think any of that's changed?
Well, I think that investors right now are being very conservative with how they spend their money, and that may continue for some time. But I think one positive benefit from the more or less crash, I guess you could say, over the last 2 years is that individual cannabis businesses are much more focused on market stability than on expansion. And that was one of the biggest problems that occurred over the last couple of years. Now that businesses have seen that wild expansion is pretty much unsustainable, and they've also seen the benefits of having large cash reserves in case there is a disaster such as the one we're in the middle of right now, that it's much better for them to really just solidify their position in the market instead of trying to grow exponentially. And, we're seeing that in every market in the country, that businesses that had large reserves or have access to capital ongoing are doing much better than the ones that don't. And unfortunately, that's going to hurt small businesses the most.
So would you think that what we're seeing, which was going through consolidation in 2019, is continuing consolidation? Do we have a situation where we don't have the capital necessarily for the industry to consolidate and grow as much as we see people struggling to survive in some markets? You're right. Other markets, there's significant amount of expansion. The Illinois market did over almost $1 billion in the first quarter, $100 million in the first quarter, which is way above expectation. So it's interesting that Illinois was one of those hot spots. It's doing well. So what do you think is likely? There are probably marginal dispensary operators out there. What do you think is going to happen? Are they going to survive, or are we going to see consolidation, or are we going to see people just going out of business and nobody wanting to buy the franchise?
So unless particularly small and medium-sized businesses are able to find some form of relief, whether that be through federal relief funding or through state loan programs. And unless they're able to decrease their financial burdens, particularly through access to banking services and other things like traditional lending, we're going to see a lot of businesses fail. A lot of businesses are going to be struggling heavily when we move into the recovery process. And so I think that we are going to see a lot of consolidation unless these small to medium-sized businesses are able to get help.
We're speaking with Morgan Fox from the National Cannabis Industry Association. Morgan, do you think it's possible that there are going to be businesses who will not find a buyer for their license in their market?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's entirely possible. There may not be as much appetite for consolidation and buyouts going forward. As I mentioned earlier, I think that a lot of the bigger businesses are concentrated much more on stability than on expansion going forward, and a lot of the smaller businesses, even despite the fact that their operational processes have kind of ground to a halt, their brands are still good, so they might still be able to find somebody to buy their company. But overall, I think that sort of consolidation is ultimately going to be bad for the industry. It really suppresses competition and suppresses diversity in both products as well as the people that are represented in the cannabis industry itself.
Depending on how that particular dispensary is operating, you're saying that there could be some in trouble. Do you have any information as to whether there are any particular parts of the industry that seem to have come through this better? Growers, producers, dispensaries, any particular segment that held its own through this pandemic?
Well, I think that every segment is struggling to some extent. It's difficult to tell which have done better. And again, I think that it really varies from market to market and from business to business. The fact that a lot of the direct-to-plant businesses have been declared essential has certainly helped them somewhat compared to some of the non-essential businesses that directly provide services to them. So they're dealing with things like supply chain interruption and service interruption and things like that. So, even the fact that these businesses have been able to stay open and have been deemed essential is, in addition to allowing them to continue to operate, is putting a lot of additional strains on them as well. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. Really, I think that it's going to take a lot of time for us to figure out exactly how all this shakes out.
Do you think that deregulation of cannabis and moving it out of a controlled substance, how long do you think it would take before we could see commerce across state lines?
Well, if cannabis is descheduled, it would immediately be regulated, or at least shortly thereafter be regulated at the federal level, and interstate commerce would certainly be part of that. However, I don't think that there's any possibility of cannabis being descheduled anytime this year. It's certainly possible in the next congressional session. So I think that if anybody is looking for an answer on interstate commerce within the next 6 to 8 months, they should probably start thinking otherwise. However, once that happens, it will certainly help pretty much every existing cannabis market, both by providing specific import jobs, such as setting up businesses that are solely focused on importing products from other states, and it would help some of the states that have gluts and are overproducing for their local markets be able to stay solvent and continue to move product without being confined to only selling within their states.
Yeah. We've been speaking with Morgan Fox from the National Cannabis Industry Association. Morgan, how do people follow you and your industry?
You can go to thecannabisindustry.org. We're also available on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. And I would also just like to tell all of your listeners to please contact your senators and urge them to support the second stage relief fund, and to make sure that safe banking is a part of that relief package.
Thank you. W420radionetwork.com. We'll be back.
You're listening to America's Cannabis Conversation. on W420RadioNetwork.com. Your new Cannabis electronic checking account can offer you PIN-secure credit and debit cards for your clients. We can place a cashless ATM at your checkout counter, which reduces the amount of cash on hand. Did you know that we can help you bring legacy cash into your new Cannabis electronic checking account? No more paying with cash. Making payments with your electronic check is safe and secure. So if you find yourself up at night worrying about somebody breaking in and stealing your cash, consider a Cannabis electronic checking account. To find out if a Cannabis electronic checking account is right for you, call 888-420-8884 and ask for Dan Perkins. That's 888-420-8844. W420RadioNetwork.com.
Welcome back to the conversation. Joining us today is a very special guest, Dr. Michael Lewis. Dr. Michael Lewis is a former United States military infectious disease specialist, retired colonel. And we're going to talk today about 6 strategies for managing stress around this infectious disease. Dr. Lewis, thank you for joining the conversation today.
Oh, it's great to join you.
So let's get right to it. 6 strategies for managing stress around infectious disease. Is this a different environment for stress than what we normally experience, like in a heavy flu season? Or what's going on in your mind, Doctor?
Well, the biggest thing is, not so much the stress of what this virus is and the illness that it's causing, but it's really how we're reacting to it. And I mean on all levels. I mean how individuals are reacting to it, anxiety, how our government is reacting to it is causing a huge amount of stress, unlike anything we've ever experienced in our lifetimes. Really, I would have to say you have to go back to 1918, 1919 to even come close to the level of stress that we're feeling, with the great influenza pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Doctor, do you think it would be appropriate to add to your list of environments that are causing stress? And I'm not being critical of you. I'm just saying, with the huge volatility and swings of, quote, data from the clinicians who are trying to formulate policy, the big swings in death and case rates, is that also putting pressure that the clinicians are bringing upon themselves and therefore bringing it upon the American people?
Well, a big part of it always, one of the biggest stressors in general is just the concept of the fear of the unknown. And that's been a big driving issue this whole pandemic, has been the fear of the unknown, because, it's a virus that we've never dealt with before. And so the action and reaction that we've been seeing at all levels are really being driven by that fear of the unknown. And that can be absolutely, I'm just trying to think of the right word. It can be completely just get people to freeze up. I mean, it's like deer in the headlights. People don't know what to do. Governments don't know really. There's no single right answer. We're going in so many different directions, and the data systems are feeding us. We got this 24/7 news cycle. We've got so much access to data that in itself has become overwhelming. In addition to it.
Yeah, Doctor, I write a lot of commentary, and early on I did a commentary based on a prognostication by the Imperial College in London, which said they believe 500,000 Brits would die and 2.3 million Americans would die. And the American media grabbed hold of that those numbers. And I think the way they publicized it, they created, if you would, a panic within the pandemic. And we've seen numbers, as low as 60,000, now back to possibly 75 to 100, but not millions like was originally forecast. I think that set the tone that when the numbers started to change, I'm not sure that the American public didn't become disenchanted with the clinicians and what they were trying to do.
Well, a lot of it gets back to, again, the unknown, but, there's a lot of things that we know that have always hold true in, I'd like to say, situations like this, but we're really in such a unique situation. But you have to understand the nature of viruses in the first place is, when you have a virus that starts to spread like this has, we hear terms like R0, the R sub-zero, and, how many people one person generally infects. That's not set in stone. I mean, over time, we understand what's the typical R0 infectability, but especially with something new, we're always trying to understand it. And so those numbers are going to change consistently, but the virus changes also. And we're starting to hear about the mutations of the virus and so on. Viruses have existed long before mankind. They're going to exist long after we're gone. We have always coexisted with them. We have to learn to coexist with them. But we need to do it, in a way that is much more reasonable. It is literally coexist, not lock ourselves in our house and be afraid of it, because even in the most remote places, we're seeing that people are somehow getting infected with this virus. So how we coexist with it, how these numbers change, how these models are always, literally, a good model should change every single day. It should input the data of the last 24 hours to rework that model. So these models are always going to change, and so we're going to see the numbers come down. They may go up a little bit, they may go down, but part of that reflects that change of a virus in itself. You have to understand, viruses cannot live outside of a host. And so if you think about Ebola, for example, 20 years ago, Ebola killed 95% of anybody that came in contact with it. Now it kills 40-50%. Why? Because if a virus kills off all its hosts, it's not going to exist anymore. Nature doesn't work that way. So as viruses spread, they become less lethal, less virulent, because in basic terms of nature, if you kill off a host, then you're going to kill off yourself. Right.
Doctor, I really want to get to your sixth strategy, so I'd like to pivot now, and let's help the audience with some of the strategies that you've come up with for managing stress. So let's start down that path. Let's start with number one.
Yeah, I know we have limited time, so we'll kind of fly through them, but a lot of them kind of work together. But number one absolutely is information, like we're talking about, information overload. We're swarmed 24/7. There's not enough news to really fill 24 hours. When we were kids, you got the morning newspaper and the evening news, right? That was enough news. Now we got 24/7. We got social media, and everybody's got their opinion, and it's just, you're swimming in it. The most important thing in my mind that we could do is turn it off. Limit yourself. We talk about, limiting screen time for kids, because we're worried about them being on iPads and playing games. We need to start thinking about limiting screen time for adults, because we just are getting too much information. You want to keep informed, but to a limit. And that leads us really quickly into the other things is get outside and exercise. Start setting good lifestyle habits that you may have forsaken over the years because you were working too hard. So daily exercise, eating healthy, being grateful for the things that we do have, being around loved ones, or use that technology in a good way and be in contact with loved ones that you can't physically be in contact with. And take a breath. We want to call it meditation, whatever, but, think about when you're under stress and you just take a couple of 2-3 deep breaths, your system calms down so quickly.
Right.
So eating, so if we start eating healthier, put down the sugar and the cake and the candies and the processed foods and eat natural, healthy foods and get out and exercise on a daily basis. And I say get outside and exercise because fresh air, sunshine, vitamin D and all that, all those things can work together. Just good, healthy lifestyle that we need to get back to.
We had the CDC tell us, wash your hands, safe distance, wear a mask, and consider gloves. 3 things that we should do. Can you give me and our audience 3 things that Dr. Michael Lewis would recommend are on your top 3 things that people should do in this disease period?
Well, I question, first of all, I'm going to say I think gloves are not a good idea. I'll just say that because most people don't know how to put them on, take them off, and then they give themselves a sense of safety that they don't really have. I don't believe gloves for the average person are actually a really good idea. I think that masks, I've seen so many, if you go to any store, it's just this comedy of how people are wearing masks or not. So most people don't even have a clue how to wear a mask. That's safe and everything. So, but 3 things. I would say take the opportunity now to set those lifestyle factors that are going to serve you in the long run. And 2 of them being diet and exercise. Eating healthy food and regular exercise would be absolutely number 1. Number 2, the idea of washing your hands cannot be overemphasized. That's really how we're going to do it. But I guess maybe more than 3. But I would say you've just got to. There's an old saying. I'm going to go back to this from World War II in England. You brought up. We started the conversation about statistics from England. Let's go back to England, and the Battle of Britain and World War II. And there was a saying, and there's posters and everything, is keep calm and carry on. And that is, I think, sums up so much of it. Stop freaking out about this. Now, if you're 75 years old and you've got all kinds of health problems, you should be not worried. You should be appropriately concerned to limit your exposure. But healthy people, young healthy people, I think the fact that we're keeping people in the house and we're going to be causing so many more problems down the line, all this financial stress is going to come out over the next months or years. It's going to come out in ways that you don't necessarily think about. Suicide's one easily that you could think about. There's going to be a major increase in suicide. There's going to be a lot of physical and mental health issues that we're going to see over the next 4 or 5 years because of this, that I don't know if we're even to the point of getting our head above the water to even think about these longer term issues. And that's one of the reasons why, people are saying, let's get the country back to work. Let's get out of this shelter in place because the long-term issues on our health, our physical health, our mental health, I think are going to be really absolutely devastating the longer we're in this economic shutdown.
Unfortunately, Doctor, we're out of time, and I want to thank you. We've been speaking with retired Colonel Michael Lewis, doctor who was a U.S. military infectious disease specialist, and he's been giving us 6 ideas of how to manage stress around infectious disease. Doctor, how do people get a hold of you or follow you in an orderly fashion and learn from your wisdom and knowledge?
Well, two big things. When I retired from the military, I started a small nonprofit focused around brain health. And certainly stress is a major decrement to brain health. So you can find a website for my nonprofit is brainhealtheducation.org. It's brainhealtheducation.org.
Mm-hmm.
And been, trying to move a little bit more onto video platforms, stuff like that. And so if you're into YouTube, go to CV Sciences. Look up CV Sciences on YouTube. That's C as in Charlie, V as in Victor. And lots of great information we're putting up on that platform all the time.
Dr. Lewis, it was a pleasure. Thank you for your knowledge, and thank you for joining us today.
Introducing the new Cannabis electronic checking account. Did you know that in 2019, almost 1 in 5 dispensaries were either robbed or broken into? Your business is cash only, because up to now you didn't have access to a banking account that would allow you to deposit the daily receipts from your business. Some owners have started a banking relationship only to be told in a few months that the institution was closing the account. For the first time, you can now have a reliable business checking account. Yes, I said a secure bank electronic checking account. For more information, call 1-888-420-8844 and ask for Dan Perkins. That's 888-420-8884 and ask for Dan Perkins. W420radionetwork.com. Want to find out if cannabis can help your medical condition? It's time to hear from our cannabis doctor on call.
Hello and welcome back to America's Cannabis Conversation. And joining us today, as promised, is a follow-up interview with Dr. Jordan Tishler, our cannabis doctor on call. We talked the last time he was here about what's going on with the pandemic and increases in the possibility of depression and a new strain of PTSD because of all the isolationism. So I've invited him to come back, and this time let's talk about how cannabis can help people deal with the anxiety and possible depression. I find it interesting, Doctor, that most of the states that have medical marijuana allowed all their dispensaries to stay open as a critical service. So welcome back to the show, and tell us, Doctor, what do you think cannabis can do to help people with their anxiety and possible depression?
Thanks. It's great to be back. I think cannabis can be very helpful in these circumstances. I think it is really a huge step forward that we have recognized in most of the states that have medical cannabis, that medical cannabis is essential. I think that's great. It's also important that these states either have or going forward need to implement better methods of distribution, right? I mean, that is to say, taking people who are sick and therefore using medical cannabis and packing them into a store to get their medicine is putting them, as well as the employees, at an unacceptable risk. Here in Massachusetts, they have fast-tracked things like home delivery and implemented curbside pickup. And I think that those go a long way to making sure that these, vulnerable cannabis-needing patients get what they need and get it safely.
Let's take what you know, and that's the state of Massachusetts. Now, I live in Florida, which is medical only, no recreational. But in the protocol in Florida is you have to go to a doctor who has to make a diagnosis, who then sells you a permit to be able to buy the cannabis, gives you a prescription. Then you take the prescription to a dispensary, and you work with the people in the dispensary to figure out what particular strain or product is important to you. That's very cumbersome, and when you've got this social isolation and people really can't travel, by and large, we don't have home delivery. So my question with that as background, how does let's say that through FaceTime we work together and you say, I think you need X, a prescription of a particular product that you know about and would recommend to a potential customer or client, patient to purchase. They've got to do they get a prescription in Massachusetts? And how do they get that to the dispensary? And do you recommend specific products, or it's up to the consumer and the people at the dispensary to figure out what is appropriate? What's the appropriate product to buy?
All good questions, complex questions. The short is, well, there's no short. Let me just dive in here. First is that you said something about the physician selling you a license, essentially. And if any physician is selling you a license, then you should run screaming away from them. They may charge you for their medical advice and expertise, but they should not be selling you a prescription. That's illegal.
Well, they're not selling you a prescription. In the state of Florida, the individual consumer literally has to have a license to buy the product.
I understand.
And the only place that they can get that license is through the doctor.
That's right.
In Florida.
But you are right. But you are paying them for their time and attention, not for the outcome of all of that.
Okay.
Physicians or clinicians who are not able and willing to provide you with the kind of guidance that you mentioned, going over, the risks and the benefits and which products are most appropriate and what method of use is most appropriate for your medical condition. Those, if you're not getting that from that physician, then that physician is not doing their job, and you should, again, run screaming. By the same token, asking for those sorts of medical advice and guidance from some kid in the pot shop, right, who has no education and furthermore has the conflict of interest that their job is to sell you more product and more different types of product, that conflict of interest is enormous. So you should not be getting your advice from the dispensary. You should be getting that advice from your knowledgeable clinician. And if you have trouble finding such a knowledgeable clinician, that's a real problem. And the Association of Cannabis Specialists can help with that. And you can Google them. But that's fundamentally the point, is that the reason these medical systems are set up to send you through a physician is because the physician is supposed to take care of you, just like if you were going to see a cardiologist or an endocrinologist or any of these sorts of things. And yes, when I work with my patients, every one of them leaves not only with having spent an hour discussing their issues and how to approach them, but they go home with a booklet of information that reviews all the things we talked about, and they go home with essentially a prescription. And I say essentially because even in Massachusetts, like in everywhere else, if I write this down, it doesn't make the dispensary do what I say, right? If I write a prescription for a blood pressure medication, you go to CVS or your local pharmacy, they have to do what I tell them. That's the law at the federal level. That's not quite the case with cannabis. So what I'm writing down ends up being sort of more of a recommendation, but everybody goes home with something very specific. I think you need to get this kind of a product, buy this much of it, use it this way, etc. And then also they go home with access to me. They have access to me by phone, by email, with subsequent follow-up visits, which they essentially have unlimited access to. We have a couple of sort of required visits over the course of the year just to make sure we're checking in and making sure it's working, making sure that nothing has changed for the worse or maybe hopefully for the better. So, we take this seriously because we think that people need care, not just a pile of weed.
So given what we're talking about this depression and isolationism that we're going through, and in some cases, some areas of the country may be going through it for another month or more. What are you recommending in terms of the kinds of cannabis product? I'm not asking you to do a commercial.
So, one of the things that, we've talked about in other episodes is that anxiety and depression can be helped with cannabis, but it's a double-edged sword. And so, for example, I saw one of my patients yesterday, and she said, I think I'm smoking way too much of this. And I said, and how's your anxiety doing? She says, it's getting worse. And I said, well, the problem is that cannabis, if you use too much of it, can make your anxiety worse, right? So that, again, getting back to our point about a knowledgeable clinician helping to guide the patient, if we simply send the patient and say, yeah, cannabis is good for depression and anxiety, go, they're going to get a whole earful from the bud tender, from the internet, from their buddies, that's going to lead them to likely use too much and too often, and that's actually going to worsen their anxiety and depression. So it, like every other medicine, there's a sweet spot where you get that benefit, and beyond that, things either get worse or you get side effects or things like that, but it's not better. And so anxiety and depression is very much one of those situations where a little bit, particularly dosed sort of before bedtime, can be very helpful and has persistent benefit throughout the next day, even though you're no longer intoxicated. And that's an ideal situation, right? We basically what we really like is to have our anxiety or depression kind of get better without being stoned. So using this stuff in the evening allows us to control the dose, have that intoxication, which is absolutely just part of the way this medicine works, but have it wear off as we sleep and get this continued benefit throughout the next day with no further intoxication intruding into our daily life. It's a very different approach from sort of the typical stoner lore, which says, wake and bake. Get up in the morning before you get going, you just get stoned and you stay stoned all the time. That's the scenario we know backfires.
So when you were talking about the lady you thought she was perhaps smoking too much, are there certain types of formulation of cannabis? I'm thinking edibles, tinctures, and smokes or tablets. Is there any one particular construction of how it's put together that's better than others, or are they all pretty much equal?
It depends on what we're treating. But in this case, where we're talking about anxiety and depression, yes, you can use edibles, but because, as everybody knows, they're sort of very slow to work, and then when they do work, they work for longer. The timing and such of that becomes kind of more of a challenge. Will it work in a pinch? Yes, but inhalation is more effective. And of course, note that when I say inhalation, I'm not saying smoking, because I don't see any reason that anyone should be smoking this when we have better, safer options. And to be specific about that, what I mean is that we should be vaporizing the cannabis flower, meaning the botanical material weed, in a specific device that is designed to do cannabis flower, and not the oil-type pens, because the oil-type pens, despite the fact that people call them vaporizers, are really burning that oil, and then we're getting exposed to all those nasty chemicals that way as well. So inhalation by vaporization of cannabis flower actually is sophisticated enough at this point that we're getting the medicine without all that crap.
When you write a prescription, you tell them what particular type of product you're looking for and what strength or concentration, if that's the right word, and then the frequency. You're doing what the pharmacy does in a regular pharmacy when they attach the label to the bottle. It tells you how frequently to take it, how many to take, and that's similar what you do?
That's exactly what I do. Although you should also know that when a physician or other clinician writes your prescription, that's what they're writing. And the pharmacy is simply putting the pills in the bottle and putting the label with our instructions on that bottle. So when I write for your amlodipine, which is a blood pressure medication, I write amlodipine, take 1 or 2 tablets once a day. Please dispense 30 or 60 tablets and, 3 refills.
Right.
So that's what that prescription is. And every patient, as I mentioned, leaves my office with a sheet of paper, or now it's a virtual sheet of paper, that says essentially the same thing. Buy some cannabis flower. I want you to buy the type that's between 15 and 20% THC. I want you to use 2 to 4 puffs before bedtime and buy, say, 1/8 of an ounce.
Yeah, I'm concerned about what this, as the president has said, he's concerned that the cure may be more damaging than the illness itself, and nobody knows for sure if that's going to happen or has happened, I guess, till we get on the other side of this. Doctor, it's always a pleasure. Thank you for joining us today. Tell our listeners how they can get a hold of you and how you can actually help them with your practice, no matter where they are in the country.
Obviously, now we're doing telemedicine 24/7, and we've always done virtual consults across the country and across the world. So all you need to go do is go to my website, which is inhalemd.com. Again, inhalemd.com, and you can reach out to us through the website. There are lots and lots of articles that you can read to understand something more about the science and also to understand more about who I am and my perspective on all these things. And I would be greatly honored if I could help you, especially in these trying times.
We've been speaking to Dr. Jordan Tishler, our Cannabis Conversation Doctor on Call. And Dr. Jordan, thank you, as always, for joining us today.
My great pleasure.
America's newest and fastest growing cannabis-focused radio network is expanding across the country and looking to add to our sales and marketing team. America's Cannabis Conversation offers listeners insight and information on the exploding world of cannabis. It also gives advertisers the opportunity to reach a hyper-targeted audience, literally neighborhood by neighborhood, in markets all across the country. We're looking for a few motivated individuals that want to essentially run their own local business in markets like Boston, Las Vegas, Reno, Orlando, and more. To learn more about this exciting opportunity or to apply, visit americascannabisconversation.com.
Well, California is number one in cannabis sales of $3 billion of any entity in the world. Yet 80% of those funds go to the illegal black market. So what do we do about that? And we're joined now by Tara Carver, the co-founder and executive director of the Humboldt County Growers Alliance. So you are in the epicenter. You are in the Emerald Triangle, where the best and the most beautiful cannabis is grown. Yet it's harder and harder to make it fly because of the restrictions and the cumbersome bureaucracies and the like. But how's it going?
It's going. We're scrappy, and so our alliance is 3.5 years old. However, we have farmers and legacy producers that have been in the industry for over 60 years. So we're very proud of our heritage and our history. And, this isn't the first time that we've had to overcome major hurdles. We've lived and survived the war on drugs, friction, controversy, and strain, I guess, is pretty familiar territory for us.
Yeah. So is it getting better with the cooperation among the growers in Humboldt and the state? Because it's all relatively new. I mean, it's only been 2 years in California. You are growing the finest cannabis in the world, yet you're kind of behind the 8 ball.
Yeah, I think part of the reality of legalization is not only is our farmers having to become business people and start understanding all the complicated factors that go into running a business, but the state agencies also had to set themselves up. And so as they've been developing, we're all kind of building together. As a trade association, we've gone through this too. And so it's been a lot of growth for industry, trade associations, and the local and state government. I'm proud of the work we've done, though. It's not all doom and gloom. There's a lot of doom and gloom out there, but I can actually say that Humboldt County's doing pretty well.
Yeah, well, that's great to hear. But the restriction on, the dual licensing, you've got municipality license, you've got state licenses, then you've got excise taxes, you've got cultivation taxes. It seems like they keep setting up roadblocks, not they, the state has, and it makes it more cumbersome, more challenging for any entrepreneur, legacy growers or otherwise.
Yeah, just to tackle the local control piece, I think an important part of understanding why 80% of the jurisdictions are still banned is that the state of California has very strong local control protections. Interestingly enough, I think my job has probably been the easiest in the state because we have a very pro-regulation, pro-moving forward county, and we've gone through 2 land use ordinances, a tax measure. But what I'm finding is from our perspective, at least, you can't force locals to regulate this. Prohibition is very strong in the mind of policymakers still. That's an education piece that needs to be happen. But if the state goes to try to force locals to develop ordinances to allow for commercial activity with cannabis, locals will find a way to break it. You can develop an ordinance that has setbacks that don't allow for the actual businesses to find footing. The counties or cities can create tax measures that essentially become de facto bans. And so really it comes down to education and grassroots organizing. The people need to get involved. If they want to have legal, tested, clean cannabis and access, they need to demand that of their policymakers, or they need to get rid of their policymakers and elect new ones.
Right. Well, let's get right to it. The track and trace from seed to sale, that's a big part of the state program with legalized marijuana, because the testing is so important, especially with the vape crisis surging in the last year or so. So tell me about the encumbrances and the benefits of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that you brought up testing. This is a piece that we're focusing on in Sacramento right now as we see the hemp industry working to regulate itself and the state working to regulate it, and testing comes up a lot. For Humboldt County, we are very proud of the fact that we pass testing, and that's a lot of that is due to the fact that we're not growing in industrial wastelands. Like, we did not have a pre-existing traditional agricultural commodity market that has a lot of pesticides and herbicides. We come from a pretty pristine place. And so for us, reaching those thresholds is not hard, and we're very, very proud of that. And we will fight very hard to keep those thresholds high, because at the end of the day, the consumer needs to have a product that is safe. And where the testing standards are right now, we believe that is what's being done.
Do you think the consumers are aware enough about the importance of the testing that the state requires? So you get certified California, authenticated, healthy cannabis versus a crapshoot on the open black market.
Yeah, I mean, right now, the way that the testing standards are set, again, which we strongly support, our cannabis is safer than the organic food you're buying. And we think that this is progress, not only just for cannabis, but really for humanity. The trickle-down effect of having high thresholds means that those inputs aren't being put on our land either. So now our waterways are cleaner as the consumer gets a tested product. Testing's a big deal.
Yeah, and what about the sun-grown aspect of cannabis in Humboldt County, where the conditions are ideal? The warm days, the cool nights, the fog rolls in a little bit. It's sort of like the wine industry looking at growing the right grapes in the old vines in Napa and Sonoma counties. Are there analogies to that, and how important is it to have the sun grown in Humboldt versus the indoor, which, as I understand it, doesn't provide for the same quality?
Yeah, so indoor is a byproduct of prohibition. When the helicopters flew, people put plants inside. So I'll just leave that indoor conversation right there. But to the outdoor conversation and true full sun, grown in native soil, the expression that we're seeing is of the product is undeniably better. I'm just going to say it, in my opinion.
Right.
Also, then provides the production method provides a option for a consumer to buy product that is the most environmentally sound product out there. Meaning that the way we grow actually gives back to the environment instead of taking away, and that is through regenerative methods.
Well, it's great catching up with you. Tara Carver, the co-founder and executive director of the Humboldt County Growers Alliance. Best of luck to you. Rich Walkoff on the W420 Radio Network.
Thank you for taking part in America's Cannabis Conversation. To hear this show in its entirety or to hear any of our archive shows, log on to americascannabisconversation.com and tune in next Saturday at 4:20 p.m. for the next installment of America's Cannabis Conversation.